the 20 people there.
So first off, of course, as always, thank you to all of our participants. Thank you for being here, for participating, for asking questions and being attentive. It's great to see. We've had a really good turnout today, so it's been really fun to see all of you. Of course, also thanks to all of our presenters today who have done a wonderful job and have really generated some great conversations. That's been wonderful, and I thank you so much. I also wanted to thank SUU students who participated in putting this on and making sure that this was a successful experience. We had SUU students who, of course, as you have seen, have prepared and given comments. As students who have sort of mentored those groups who have been giving comments, as well as students who have participated in reviewing all of the submissions and helping us to make a selection. Thank you to all of you for your work on that. Thanks, of course, to my colleagues at SUU, Chris Phillips and Kirk Fitzpatrick, who have put a lot of work not only into this conference, but also the program as a whole. They're wonderful colleagues, and it's great to have this program. In addition, outside of the philosophy program itself, I want to thank the Department of Languages and Philosophy that has always been really helpful and supportive in putting this on. Several of our faculty have been here today, so I thank you for being here and supporting us today. The Dean's Office, Dean Barine was here earlier, and the Dean's Office has been very helpful, as well as the Office of the Provost and the Office of the President that have been really supportive in this whole process and making sure that we've been able to continue having this conference for this is the 7th year. It's been wonderful. Of course, thank you as well to our administrative assistant in our office, Jenny Lee Thayer, who does a huge amount of work organizing, coordinating, keeping us on track, and so forth. We genuinely wouldn't do it without her. So if you see her, give her a nice thank you. I know most of the external participants won't be seeing her, but SUU students, don't forget to thank Jenny. All right, I think I have hit all of those points. So now I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Jonathan Jenkins Ichikawa, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia. I'm really excited for him to give our keynote address today. Dr. Ichikawa is a researcher in, I know him best as a researcher within epistemology, and especially the relationship between epistemology and feminist philosophy, rape culture in particular, although he does a lot of work in a lot of areas. He's written and or edited 3 books plus another book, I think, which is an online open source logic textbook, many articles, book reviews, chapters of books and so forth in epistemology, in philosophy of language, and many other areas. He recently has gained a grant through the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for work on rape culture and epistemology. And the presentation he's going to be given today is, as I understand it, a part of that project. So today's presentation is called Not What I Agreed to, Consent and Content. I ask you all to help me welcome Dr. Jonathan Jenkins Ichikawa.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and for having me here. I'm really glad to have a chance to share this project with you. I'm sharing my screen. I think you can see my slides. Maybe, yep, I see a thumbs up. Thank you. I also have a handout, which I'll just put a link to that in the chat. The handout and the slides are largely redundant information. The handout's there, so if the slides went by too fast and you want them to slow down, you can look at them there. All right, I'm going to just move a couple of things around in my windows so I have everything exactly where I want it to be. That looks good. And let's jump in. So I want to start by just noting a couple of things, doing a couple of acknowledgements. Oh, come on now, there we go. First, there's that handout, which I just mentioned. Second, the work that I'll be presenting today is based on a paper that is co-authored that I've been working on with one of my PhD students, Emily Tilton at UBC. So kind of standard provisos about co-authored work. The great ideas are all, mostly Emily's responsibility. The stupid things that I say are definitely just down to me here. All right. I also just want to make a couple of content notes. As you can tell from the title, this talk is about consent, including especially sexual consent. This is kind of actually tangentially related to my project on epistemology and rape culture. I got that grant a few years ago, and I was thinking a lot about testimony and sexual assault reports, and I'm still thinking a lot about those topics. But I ended up kind of along the way getting into interests in like feminist sexual ethics itself, with like less direct connections to epistemology. And what I'm doing today is actually an example of that work. So the talk today will be about consent. For that reason, you might not be surprised to hear that it will include discussion of sexual assault, not in any like graphic or like very sort of engaged kind of way. But one of the main questions that I'll be talking about is under what circumstances are different kinds of sexual interactions violations of consent. Don't be surprised that that's what this talk is about. Maybe slightly less predictably, I will talk about fairly specific sexual activities. And by specific, I mean not like pornographic, but description in greater specificity than you might be used to seeing in like philosophy papers. Where some people might say, here's a thought experiment where these characters have sex. For purposes that'll be clear as I get into it, the details are going to be a little bit more important to me. So I am going to be saying things like, this man puts his penis inside this woman's vagina. Those details are going to be relevant. So I wanted to let you know that I will be talking in those terms. I will also be talking a bit about transphobia today. That's not central, but some of the examples that's a theme that there are some things to say about. So with those content acknowledgements out of the way, let's jump in. The set of questions that are motivating this project take their home in the philosophical literature in questions about the relationship between deception and a valid consent. And so I'll give you some more theory about like just how that works in a minute. And actually, I'm going to critique kind of the standard theory of these kinds of cases. But I think it's a useful way to kind of get into questions to begin with is to just think about the kinds of cases that are motivating the questions. So here are just a few thought experiments. These are all going to be thought experiments that involve sex and deception. And one of the key verdicts that you'll be like, that one might wonder about these thought experiments are questions about consent to that sexual interaction. So here's case number one. I call it identity. Don disguises himself as Alfred in order to have sex with Thea, Alfred's wife. This works. Thea, believing Don to be her husband, agrees to have sex with them, and they have sex. So this is a person who has sex with someone under a false belief about what person that is. Here's case number two. This is Condom. Bryson and Evelyn meet at a bar and they agree to have sex together. They agree to have sex together using a condom. But Bryson was lying about his willingness to use the condom. So when they go to have sex, he stealthily removes his condom without Evelyn noticing, and they end up having unprotected sex. That's case number two. Case number three is called interest. George and Franklin meet on a dating app where they both indicated that they were looking for long-term partners. But Franklin was lying about looking for a long-term partner. Franklin is actually just looking for hookups. George thinks Franklin might be a potential long-term partner and agrees to have sex with him, and they have sex. One more case. This is a case called Taste. Caroline accompanies Chandra to her daughter's art show. She thinks that art is pretty stupid, but she wants Chandra to like her, so she lies and tells her that she enjoyed looking at her daughter's art. Chandra is pleased to hear this. The date goes well, and they end up having sex that night. All right. So four cases that have some things in common and some things importantly different. The things in common, I think, are fairly conspicuous. They all involve people having sex, and having sex where, like, one person did say yes to the other person's sort of sexual overture, but where there was deception about something involved. And the big difference between these cases is you might think of as the serious of the level of deception, right? If you're deceived about who it is that you're saying yes to, that kind of feels like it's a really big deal, maybe in a way that undermines consent. If you're deceived about like whether someone was just being polite when they said, I like daughter's art, you might think that's a rather trivial matter. It is a deception. It's a deception that like played a role in leading someone to agree to have sex. But in what intuitively it seems like might be a much less serious way. So here's the standard thing to say about cases like this. Standard thing to say about cases like this are, one, there's a really big difference between the things at the beginning of that list and things at the end of the list. The ones at the beginning were very bad deceptions, and they're deceptions that like implicate consent. I think a pretty natural thing to say, I think that a lot of people would want to say is, oh, if the reason you said yes is someone lied to you about who they were, or whether they're going to use a condom, then actually, if you end up having sex, even though you did say yes, that wasn't like real consent. That like, a lot of people would say that that's a sexual assault that just happened there. That's a common verdict about cases like that. People don't typically say this is the corresponding thing about cases on the second half of my list, the intuitively less serious cases of deception. Maybe it's always bad to deceive people. I mean, yeah, there's something uncomfortable about lying to your date, but most people wouldn't say that like if you told a white lie about enjoying someone's daughter's art in order to kind of make the date go better, and that ended up like helping you have sex with them, most people would say maybe there's something iffy about that. Some people would say there's nothing at all iffy about that. But even if there's something iffy about that, most people would say that's not something that like implicates consent kinds of questions. So if that's the way that you kind of carve these cases up, then the really obvious theoretical question is going to be, okay, so what's the difference? Under what circumstances does deception invalidate consent? Sometimes the deception is so bad that it makes the consent not count. Other times it's not like that. And what's the difference? There's a research question. There's a nice kind of set of articles talking about this question. I'll talk about some of those articles in a moment. Let me set up a little bit more about the theoretical background, what I mean when I talk about invalidating consent. You may or may not have come across kind of this kind of material in your studies of ethics already. So let's just make sure it's on the table. Here's the kind of normal way to think about consent. People typically think about consent in terms of rights. People think about consent as a kind of thing somebody can do, that, to use a standard metaphor, modifies the normative landscape. In particular, there are things that under ordinary circumstances you have rights against. This is much more general. It's not just sex, right? So if you own property, if you have a house, then you have a right against trespass. No one's allowed to just walk into your house because that's your house. But if you consent to their entering your house, then you've waived that right, and now they can walk in without violating your rights. So consent gets rid of or waives these rights that you would have if not for the consent. And in the case of bodily integrity, you might well think the same goes in both sexual and non-sexual cases, right? I have a right not to be punched in general. You'd violate my rights if you just came up and punched me. But if we're in a certain kind of circumstance where I consent to your punching me, maybe we're gonna do a boxing match, then I've waived that right against it. And so likewise for sexual contact, right? Ordinarily, people have rights against sexual touching, sexual penetration, sexual contact of all sorts, but you can waive that right by consenting. That's kind of the standard way to think about how consent interacts with rights in ethics. I actually have some critiques of this kind of this big picture, but that's not my project today. I'm going to take that on board for the purpose of argument. So if you have that background assumed, then you can rephrase the question on the last slide like this. Under what circumstances does saying yes count as real consent? And the vocabulary people use for this, valid consent is the name for consent that counts, that's morally transformative in this relevant way. Your consent is valid just in case you have genuinely waived this right. If the reason you said yes is someone is holding a gun to your head and you're coerced, then you might say yes, maybe that counts as consent in some sense, but it's not valid consent. You still have a right against it. That yes didn't really count. So the kind of standard assumption for these deception cases is that some but not all of them involve deception that invalidates your consent. When Thea says, yes, I will have sex with this person that she thinks is Alfred, her husband, she's deceived. And because she's deceived, that's kind of relevantly like having the gun held to her head. Even though she said yes, that wasn't morally transformative. That again is the kind of normal thing to say. And then of course the question is, okay, so which kinds of deception are like that? Since intuitively some of them seem to have this result and others don't. Okay, here's what I'm doing. I'm going to say actually that framework is like not the best way to think about these questions. I think that there are consent violations in the identity and the condom cases, and indeed not in the interest and taste cases. So I'm going to like hold on to those kind of pretty natural intuitions, but I'm going to explain this story in a different kind of way. I don't think that focusing on the circumstances under which deception invalidates consent is the right way to explain what goes wrong in those cases, or the right way to explain the difference between the kinds of cases that I opened with. So that's the main plan, that's the main project. I'm going to work up to that by going through one of the kind of standard approaches in the literature, and that's Tom Dougherty's approach, which emphasizes a notion that he calls deal breakers. So that's where I'm going to start. Dougherty is really working within this kind of more traditional framework that I'm ultimately interested in resisting, but it's useful to kind of go through what he says and talk about it a bit. So let's do that. Here's Tom Dougherty, professor of philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill. Dougherty says, yeah, I see that there's like this intuition that if somebody lies about certain really serious things, that's really bad and implicates consent. But if they lie about other more trivial things, then that like doesn't invalidate consent. He recognizes that's an intuitive thing to say, but he thinks that actually it's a bad idea to build your theory on that distinction. He says basically there's just no good way to distinguish what he calls core from peripheral features of sex acts. Instead, his view is going to be that if there's a deal breaker that you don't know about, that always invalidates your consent. A deal breaker is a feature of the situation where if you knew about it, you wouldn't have said yes. And we can imagine in all four of those cases that I began with, there might well be a deal breaker. I mean, it depends on the specifics of the case, but I think the most interesting way to imagine them in terms of the dialectic of this literature is to suppose that they all do involve deal breakers. In other words, when Bryson says to Evelyn, yes, let's have sex, I'll use a condom, and he's lying about it. If she had known that he didn't intend to use a condom, then she never would have said yes. That's a fairly like realistic stipulation to add to that case, right? And likewise, George has sex with Franklin thinking that he might be a potential long-term partner. If he knew that Franklin was just looking for hookups, maybe he never would have said yes. That's, he maybe not, but let's stipulate that that's the way that his reaction would have been. And likewise, here, this is maybe less obvious, but certainly conceivable. If Chandra knew that Caroline was lying about liking her daughter's art, then she wouldn't have agreed to have sex with her. That's a stipulation that I'd like us to take on board. All right. So what Dougherty says is in all of those cases, since there's a deal breaker, there's no valid consent. This is a strong line. This has counterintuitive consequences, which he's well aware of. He wants those consequences. But just to make sure we're all clear, on the Dougherty view, it doesn't matter whether in any like objective sense that deception was something that was important. A kind of natural thing to say is, oh, if you lie about a condom, condoms are a big deal. If you're lying about liking the daughter's art is not a big deal. Dougherty says, no, that's not a good thing to say. One reason is that he's like a little bit skeptical about locating this distinction in the metaphysics of sex acts, like the idea, okay, there's some things that are like essential to sex, maybe whether there's a condom is like an essential part of it, whether there was a white lie early in the evening is not. He thinks that like metaphysically that distinction is kind of suspect. And maybe more centrally, he thinks that the attempt to draw these kinds of lines is in effect to kind of moralize in an objectionable way. So the idea, it's bringing in these kind of conservative ideas about which things really do matter and which things really don't matter for sex. And Dougherty has this kind of liberal attitude that says, look, people should be able to decide for themselves what's important to them. And it's none of our business as like normative theorists to say these features matter and these features don't. If they matter to the person, then they will invalidate that person's consent. That's the Dougherty view. And the way that he implements this is that he says the subject's dispositions are the only things that matter, the disposition. So would they have said yes if they'd known about this deal breaker? If not, then their yes doesn't count. It's not genuine, valid consent. So it is going to be an implication of this view, right? I think this is clear, but I just want to make sure we're all on board. It is going to be an implication of this view that like my taste example is going to be a sexual assault on Dougherty's view. Because she said yes, but there was a deal breaker. If she'd known that she was lying about her daughter's art, then she wouldn't have said yes. So her yes was not morally transformative. She retained her right against that sexual contact, and so she was sexually violated. That's Dougherty's view about this case. I think that's, like most people, I think that's a surprising implication. Dougherty thinks he has a good argument that takes us there. I'm not convinced. So I'll give a few arguments now against Dougherty. One of them, calling it an argument may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's that thing I just said. Giving what is to my mind an implausible verdict about cases like taste, I think is a reason not to have Dougherty's view. There's one argument. Here's a couple more cases. And these cases illustrate sort of things that are interesting that I will explain in a moment. So here's a case. This case is called Passing. Greg is romantically interested in Laura, who's a trans woman. Laura generally passes. That is to say, most people can't tell like by sight that Laura is trans. Greg, like most people, is unaware that Laura was designated male at birth. They go on a date and they have sex, and Greg remains ignorant throughout the encounter that Laura is trans. Had he known that she was trans, he would not have agreed to have sex with her. In other words, that is a deal breaker for Greg. There's a possible case. I don't think it's completely obvious what to say about this case, but the thing that I think is the best thing to say about this case is that there is no consent problem here. Dougherty can't say that. Dougherty has to say, since Laura's status as trans is a deal breaker for Greg, his consent to sexual contact with her is invalid, and so she sexually assaulted him. That is, that is a thing people say. There are so-called gender fraud prosecutions. I think this is on the whole quite bad and quite transphobic, but I recognize that there are a variety of opinions on this kind of a question. I'll talk more about that a little bit later on in the talk. One thing, I'll give you some more general morals in a minute. Let me get a couple more cases on the table. Here's another case that I think counts against Dougherty. This is a case I call Indifferent Condom. It's a modification of the original Condom case. So as before, Bryson and Evelyn meet at a bar. They agree to have sex together. They agree to use a condom. As before, Bryson's lying about his willingness to use that condom, and he removes it without her noticing, and they have unprotected sex. So far, it's just like the original case. Here's the twist. Evelyn doesn't care. So later on, she notices that he snuck the condom off without her watching. And instead of feeling violated, she shrugged her shoulders and says, "Oh yeah, I don't mind." If he'd asked in the first place about having unprotected sex, she would have been fine with that. She doesn't even mind that he like stealthily removed it without asking. Right? I mean, Evelyn's psychology is different from a lot of people's psychology, but I don't think there's anything incoherent about someone responding in this kind of a way. Again, I don't think it's like totally obvious what to say about this case, but here's what I want to say. Here's what like seems to me the right thing to say. No, actually, even though Evelyn like ended up not minding, something happened that she didn't agree to. The consent was consent to have sex with a condom, and a different kind of sex that she did not agree to happened instead. Turns out it was sex like she would have agreed to. It's not even sex that she like minded having had without having agreed to it. But I kind of think there is actually a consent violation in the Indifferent Condom case. Again, I don't think it's a totally obvious thing to say. But that's kind of what I want to say. One more case. I'll go quickly because time's short. This is a case from Hallie Liberto at the University of Connecticut. This is just a quote from Hallie. A has sex with B knowing there's a small chance she might get pregnant. And she does get pregnant from this sex. If she'd known that the sex would involve impregnation, then she would not have agreed to the sex. But she consented to the gamble. Like, she knew she was taking a risk. So here's Hallie's point. I think it's a good point. If you look at the letter of the deal breaker kind of rule, if there's a feature of the situation such that if she'd known it, she would have said no, well, that's satisfied here, right? Because there is a feature of the situation. Namely, this is sex that's going to lead to pregnancy, and pregnancy is not something that she wants. Unless you kind of do some fancy sort of tweaking your definition of deal breakers, this is going to end up looking like a counterexample to Dougherty as well. Here are a few general morals that I would like to point to. First, Dougherty is motivated by this idea that people should decide for themselves, or people should be able to decide for themselves what's important to them in their sexual encounters. And I'm totally on board with that. But I don't agree with Dougherty that like dispositions to agree under various counterfactual epistemic circumstances is the only or the best way to account for these judgments about agency. Dougherty says, we need to really care how they would react. So I'm going to build into our normative theorizing the facts about how they would react. There's other ways you can build an agency. You can emphasize what they really did agree to, not what they would have agreed to in different kinds of counterfactual circumstances. And I think that like my Indifferent Condom case really kind of gestures at that issue fairly precisely. The issue isn't about what she would have minded. It's about what she said yes to, and something else happened, which is why I think there's a consent violation. Moreover, like insofar as we're interested, as I and Dougherty both am, in the relationship between sexual ethics and, broadly speaking, politics, Dougherty has this idea that if you try to say some features are core features and some are peripheral features, then you're doing this like regressive moralizing. And I see like why he says that in the context of the particular questions that he's thinking about. But one thing that I hope that my cases bring out is that there are like what seem clearly to be recognizable as progressive motivations that are pulling in different directions. In saying, let me put it this way: it's just not generally more progressive to say less stuff counts as consensual, more stuff has to be disclosed. And I think that the trans case is a good example of kind of illustrating this particular reaction and pressure in a different direction from Dougherty's. All right. I dithered about whether to include this next section. I compromised by like not including it, but just putting a slide. I'll just mention there's a thing here. So you might be tempted at this point to kind of fuss around a little bit with your definition of deal breakers and say, okay, like only certain kinds of deal breakers count. It's ones that like aren't defeated in other ways or something like that. You could try to do this. I spent some time trying to do this. I noticed two things. One, I noticed that it's really hard to like do a good job doing that. But two, so my background is in analytic epistemology, and I cut my teeth in undergrad and grad school on like the Gettier problem and stuff like that. And I noticed that like the project was extremely similar, down to like the structure of counterexamples. The idea of like undefeated deal breakers versus, if you know this literature in epistemology, like undefeated defeaters in your like theory of knowledge literature, they end up having very similar kinds of counterexamples. In fact, once you're kind of really good at playing the Gettier game, you can apply like some of the insights from over there to like some of the natural ideas over here too. I'm not going to go through that in detail for you just because of time. I'll talk in the Q&A if you want about it. But I'll just report to you that the post-Gettier literature makes me quite pessimistic about the prospects of like finessing the deal breakers approach to get around these kinds of worries. All right. So what do I say instead? Again, I like there being a distinction between the more serious deception cases and less serious deception cases. I do think that has something to do with consent. I don't like Dougherty's approach that says there's no distinction there. But I do like his motivation that says it's kind of weird to kind of look to the metaphysics of sex acts to like, you know, ascertain once and for all which are the things that are really important and which are not. Right? What are we going to do instead? I'm going to look to metasemantics. I'm going to look to questions about the content of what exactly someone is agreeing to when someone says yes in the context of a sexual encounter. To get started here, just a little bit of clarification. This is sort of a boring slide, but it'll help us like talk more clearly about these issues. Here's a tempting argument form that I would like to convince you is invalid. S consented to phi, and phi happened. Therefore, S consented to what happened. If you like just look at that, you might think that's valid. That kind of seems like it sort of makes a certain amount of sense. But I'd like to convince you to be suspicious of arguments of this form. So here's like one counterexample to this form is outside the sexual realm. Suppose I give you permission to come into my house. The way I do that is I say to you, I'm having, you know, we're imagining a post-COVID world, right? I'm having a dinner party. Come on over at 7. Feel free to just come in, right? Don't need to knock. Suppose I say that to you, right? And then suppose what happens is you pick my lock and sneak into the house at the middle of the night. I think that actually this is now a counterexample of the schema. I did consent to your coming into my house, and you came into my house, but your coming into my house wasn't something that I consented to, or the way that you did it was not something that I consented to. I consented to a different way that you might have come into my house, not that one. Something very similar, I think, can happen in the case of sex. So in general, when you consent to something under some description, you're typically consenting to a more specific way that it might happen. Yeah, this set of possibilities on this slide here is really just a formalization of the coming into the house example that I just mentioned. That specificity is quite often implicit. In fact, in the case of inviting you into my house, you know, I might have said, you're welcome to come into my house on Thursday at 7 p.m., but at no other time. I might have said that. But like, that's not how I usually issue invitations. I usually just say, yeah, I'm having a dinner party on Thursday, be around 7, come on over, let yourself in. You know, I don't specify under exactly what circumstances am I saying it's okay for you to come in. We rely on like our background conventions to determine just what kinds of behaviors am I giving you a green light to here. And importantly, you don't need to talk about the circumstances under which consent is invalid. These kinds of central ethical questions about when does the agreement actually transform the rights. You don't need to talk about that in order to make this distinction. There's one distinction that's about like, is this genuine valid consent? Is it morally transformative? Does it waive rights that I have? There's just a different question, assuming that it does, or indeed even if it doesn't, but let's assume that it does. There's a particular content that I'm saying yes to. And articulating that content is sometimes not a trivial matter. And that, I think, is where most of the action is in this set of questions that I started out by motivating. So let's start applying this thought to cases. Let's go back to the identity case. So here, once again, Thea says yes to this person whom she falsely believes is her husband. Here's what I think is happening. She is consenting to a particular activity, namely sex with Alfred, her husband. And that consent might be perfectly valid. There's nothing in the case that like I feel like makes me deny that. But she does not give consent of any kind. She doesn't even agree to have sex with Dawn. That's not something that she intended to do, and it's not something that I think she literally did. So the sex that ends up happening, which is sex with someone with whom she hasn't consented to have sex with, ends up being a consent violation. This can happen, this might happen through explicit restrictions, right? She might say, oh yes, I'm willing to have sex with you because you are my husband, Alfred, and if you were anyone else, then I would say no. She could say that. That's not, I guess different people engage in their sexual discourse in different ways. But in my experience, it's not particularly typical to be like that explicit about what one is consenting to when one agrees to sex. A lot of that can be left implicit, and conventions kind of pick up that slack there. Let's talk about the condom case. I think what happens in this case is that Evelyn gave consent to sex with a condom, and that consent was totally valid. I think that was morally transformative consent to have sex with a condom, such that now if she went on to have sex with a condom, that would not have been a rights violation of her. But she did not give any kind of consent, valid or invalid, to unprotected sex. There's just no agreement to sex without a condom that's happening here. So if sex without a condom is what ends up happening, then that happens without her consent, which explains why there is a consent violation. And once again, I'll talk in more detail about this in a minute. But once again, the specific content there might be more explicit or it might not be, right? And in the case of a condom, it's not especially unusual to be fairly explicit about the use of a condom. Although I will talk about that in a little more detail coming on. But under certain circumstances, when it's clear that a condom is expected, or it's clear that it's in the common ground that a condom is going to be used if there's going to be sex, that can quite often amount to a restriction on the content of the consent if one says yes. It's understood if you just say yes, that you mean yes, but you have to keep the condom on, and if you take it off, then that becomes a no. I think that's the literal meaning of the kind of consenting language in many of these cases. Here's an argument for looking at things my way as opposed to dowries, or indeed anybody else's who thinks that consent is invalidated in this case. Imagine a version of the case that starts as before. Bryson lies about his willingness to use a condom. He is intending to, stealthily remove his condom when he gets the opportunity. But let's imagine he changes his mind, and he has a little bit of conscience saying, no, I shouldn't take off this condom the way that I intended to. I'm going to keep it on. If that's what he does, and then he proceeds to have sex with her while using the condom, then I think the fairly obvious thing to say is there's no consent violation at all. What happens is what she thought was going to happen. It's what she literally agreed to. You might be unhappy about the bad character displayed by Bryson's intentions to do something bad, but then he decided not to do that bad thing. So if you think that the deception invalidates the consent, then you should think that her consent was not morally transformative, and so did not waive her right against sexual interaction. But that, I submit, is just intuitively the wrong result in this case. She has waived her right against sex with a condom. She hasn't waived her right against sex without a condom. And so making that distinction at the level of content as opposed to the level of validity is, I think, the right thing to say. All right, let's press on. What do I say about my other cases, the ones that were intuitively less morally weighty deceptions, the interest case and the taste case? Well, like I said, I don't think that there is a consent violation here. How am I going to explain that? What is the difference? Well, like I've already signaled, I don't think there's very good prospects for trying to make a deep metaphysical claim about whether you're wearing a condom is essential to what kind of sexual activity it is, which whether you're looking for a serious relationship isn't. I don't think that's very promising. I also, for reasons I've already mentioned, don't like the dowry idea of just kind of putting everything in the psychological dispositions of the subject. That, I think, makes consent kind of depend on like weird idiosyncratic preferences the person might not even be aware of. The way that I want to respect agency is by respecting what they actually agree to, not what they would have agreed to in different kinds of circumstances. And the way that I can do that is, again, by looking at the conventions that govern consenting behavior. You consent by doing things like, for example, saying yes. That's a bit of language that gets a richer context in a complicated way, the way that language in general gets richer contexts. So I've talked about this some already. Let's go into a little bit more detail. Here is Joseph Fischel, who has this really interesting book called Screw Consent that I quite like. I recommend his book. His approach to these issues is to say, yeah, people just need to be way more explicit about what they're consenting to. And his way of getting the dowry point, people can do whatever they want, is, yeah, people can put in whatever explicit or restrictions they want. So you can say, yeah, I'll have sex with you, but only if you wear a condom, or I'll have sex with you only if you want a relationship. I'll have sex with you only if you were born with a penis, if you're like, really afraid of, having sex with trans women, for example. Or for that matter, you can agree to have sex with someone only on the condition that they were born in Idaho, if for some reason you're really, animated by concerns about the circumstances under which your sex partner was born. You can put in whatever restriction you want, but according to Fischel, you have to make it explicit for it to kind of do the relevant, reserve the relevant rights. I don't think like that requirement is very plausible. I just don't think it's, I think it's pretty clear that it's not necessary to specify all the features that are going into the assumptions going into your consenting behavior. I think it's certainly not particularly common to specify all that much. And I think it's arguably not metaphysically possible to specify enough to do the relevant kind of work here. I think instead that we're going to rely to a considerable degree on social conventions for filling out these kinds of semantic specifics. And here's the basic idea. We live in a social world where we kind of learn what kinds of sexual interactions are normal, and certain kinds of conditions end up coming standard. Conditions about like whom it is that you're agreeing to have sex with are pretty clear examples like this. Examples like, or conditions like whether you're wearing a condom are pretty clearly like this too. I mean, it's relevant, I think, that there are, educational campaigns about rules about condom use, telling people under what circumstances is your consent kind of conditional in this way. And that, I think, is literally setting the meanings of our consenting language. And we don't have a corresponding convention having to do with, for example, scrupulous honesty on your settings on your swiping app. One can insist on these things. George could say, I'm only willing to have sex with you if you see me as a long-term partner. And then if Franklin lies to him and says that he does and has sex with him under those circumstances, then like that is a consent violation, I think. But he would need to be explicit in that way. All right. Here's a really important point. When I'm emphasizing the role of social conventions here, you might get the wrong idea. You might think that I just mean, so there's no real facts about kind of what people are agreeing to, or, whatever people think you mean is what you really mean. But that's not how social conventions work. Social conventions are real things. Social constructions are real. There are facts about what the conventions operative are. One can be right or wrong about what the conventions are. So in general, like thinking that someone is consenting to something just does not make it true. In the same way that like thinking that what I mean by a particular sentence doesn't make your interpretation accurate. Even though language is socially constructed and at a broader social level, society does determine the meanings of my words. That doesn't mean that like you get a free pass against misinterpreting me by just taking me to mean whatever you want. You know, there are these famous examples of, you know, there's a case in Ireland a number of years back, young woman who you know, rested on the fact that she was like wearing sexy underwear, and you know, people, feminists rightly complained, like a thong is not consent, and that's completely right. It's not. The way that I say that is by kind of you know, saying what I think is the truism, that it is not a social convention in our society that like wearing thong underwear is consent to you know, sexual contact by strangers. I think that's an obvious fact about the society that we live in, despite the fact that like some people in the grip of rape culture might disagree. You know, social conventions are things you can be right or wrong about. And so in saying that these are conventional matters, I am not saying that like, you know, rapists get to fix all the conventions. Feminists are part of society too. Okay. All right, so let me go through a few more examples to kind of, I hope, make it more plausible / obvious that consent has to pick up a lot of slack in cases like these. And this is true in non-sexual and in sexual cases. So here's a non-sexual example. Here's a fact about our society. This is a little weirder now because of COVID, but this is still a convention, which is why this would be a kind of weird act. If you, under certain kinds of circumstances, you know, walk up to, I don't know, 4 feet away from someone and you stretch out your hand toward them like this, you are consenting to have your hand shaken, right? That is a typical way to suggest that someone shake your hand. It's a much weightier move now than it used to be. That's a totally contingent matter, right? It's totally contingent that going like this amounts to consent to being touched. It's also totally contingent that going like this does not amount to consent to a sexual interaction. We live in a society where we've learned the appropriate thing to do when someone stretches their hand like this. Okay, you're allowed to like grasp their hand and, you know, squeeze it a little bit, but not too much. That doesn't mean you can touch their face. It doesn't mean you can touch other parts of them. It just means you can shake their hand. That's a convention that we've worked out, and that's a fairly arbitrary conventional social matter. Let's think about sexual cases. Here's a thought experiment. First kiss. Ravi walks Laura home after a pleasant first date. They linger in conversation a few minutes at her doorstep, and he asks, "May I kiss you?" Laura smiles, looks him in the eyes, and says, "I would like that." And he kisses her. All right, so what's happened here? I would like that. It's pretty explicit, although not like 100% explicit, that she's consenting to being kissed. There is like actually a convention here that's saying "I would like it," you know, amounts to saying yes, you have permission here. That I think is a fact to notice. That's not my main point here, but I think it's a useful fact to notice. Here's what I really want to point out. There's all this tacit knowledge that we have about what exactly she has given permission for under the circumstances. She's explicit, or you know, she's pretty close to being explicit that he has permission to kiss her. But there's like all kinds of things that he might do that include kissing her that he doesn't have permission to do. You know, he can't like, you know, get on his knees and like kiss her on the buttocks right now, right? She hasn't given permission for that. That would be a consent violation under the circumstances. He probably has permission to kiss her on the lips. That's like kind of by default in situations like this one. But think also about other things besides kissing. I think he has permission to touch her with his hands. If he said, "May I kiss you?" and she says yes, and it's not only his lips that like get to touch her now. Like a pretty normal thing to do would be to put his hands on her body in certain ways, but not others, right? He can touch her shoulder, maybe he can touch her face. He can't grab her breasts right now just because she said yes to kissing, right? This is a lot of like specific cultural knowledge that we just kind of pick up along the way here. And this is sort of what I mean when I say the conventions pick up the slack between like the literal meanings of the words that we say and what exactly is being agreed to. Condoms. So I mentioned earlier that that under certain circumstances, when you're engaging with sexual penetration, the expectation that one will use the condom might be in place even if it's not explicit. There are lots of ways to signal that you expect a condom to be used and that make your yes to sexual penetration conditional on that use. One thing that I think actually is relevant here, and this actually comes up in legal cases, is just communicating a preference that you have to use condoms. If earlier in the date you say, sexual safety is important to me, and so I always use condoms when I have sex with new partners. If you made that clear, that's going to be like part of the background for interpreting whether you've consented to sex without a condom later on, if that comes up. This actually like does come up in criminal cases. Or imagine a little bit later. So now you're in the bedroom and you're kissing, you're engaging in sexual activity. Maybe clothing is starting to come off. At a certain point, you might like ask, "Hey, do you have a condom?" Asking that question under certain circumstances like these, will have a very strong tendency to make subsequent consent to sexual penetration conditional on the use of that condom. The fact that you asked about the condom at that point means that your yes later means yes if there's a condom, yes if there's a condom, not yes whether or not there's a condom. Or even it doesn't have to be mentioned at all. Like if you just hand someone a condom at the right moment, that also like makes it clear that your consent is conditional in this way. Indeed, in the case of condoms, handing someone a condom under certain kinds of circumstances can itself amount to consent to sexual penetration using the condom. That might be like as much yes as you give. If you have other body language that kind of makes this a reasonable interpretation, handing someone a condom can be a way of inviting them to penetrate you. These are, I hope you'll recognize, very condom-specific conventions. There's nothing about like handing someone an object that means, in general, that you're insisting that someone wear it if they want to have sex with you, right? Condoms are like that, but like imagine instead of a condom, imagine there's a stormtrooper helmet. So same sort of situation that we've just been thinking about. Date's gone great, and you're like, you're making out with somebody, clothes are coming off, you're very excited, and at a particular point, your partner like hands you the stormtrooper helmet. Well, like that might be an invitation to wear the stormtrooper helmet the way that like the condom would also be an invitation to wear it. But like, it's definitely not any kind of consent to penetration unless it's a very specific convention that you've established. But it's also, here's maybe the more important point, the more relevant point. If I hand someone a stormtrooper helmet and say yes to penetration, and they put it on and we start having sex. And then after a few minutes, maybe they decide, actually, the stormtrooper helmet's like kind of uncomfortable. I'd feel better if I took it off. And then they just take it off without stopping or without asking or without checking first. And, maybe we imagine the lights are off, so I don't even notice. In a case like that, I think it's pretty obvious that unless I said something very specific when I consented to sex, making it conditional, there's no consent violation here, even though the exact same fact pattern would amount to a consent violation if it were a condom. So what I'm doing here when I'm going through this is I'm just kind of pointing out that we come to our sexual interactions with a lot of conventional knowledge that I think plays really important roles in fixing the contents of our consenting behavior. And that kind of issue, I think, is like the best way to explain those differences in cases that I began with. I'm just about out of time. I was hoping to have a little bit more time to talk about bad conventions, but I'll mention this really quickly. Here's something that is true and that people sometimes think is a problem with my view. Some conventions are unjust. There are bad conventions. Society encodes a lot of bad ideas, especially bad ideas about sex, and like transphobic issues are ones that I've already been mentioning. There are others too. Actually, I mentioned the kind of sexy underwear, rape culture kind of issue too. So there's a lot of bad stuff in society, and that does make its way into particular kinds of conventions. Now, in my opinion, in the circles that I run in, there is not by default a responsibility of trans people to disclose their status as trans before having sex. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a point of some controversy. There are, communities whose individuals have more transphobic attitudes, which may amount to some pressure in favor of transphobic consent conventions, which is quite bad for, I think, obvious reasons, among them that it places burdens that are both unfair and, in fact, in many cases dangerous on trans people to disclose. Some people say, Jonathan, your view allows that this is possible, and that's a bad feature of your view. I don't look at it that way. I think that my view explains why that's harmful, given that it happens. A way I might put it is I don't think that consent theory is the right place to like try to solve transphobia. I think that insofar as there are communities with conventions like this is a framework that explains one of the respects in which that is harmful. And dismantling those conventions is a project for a different kind of, it's a task for a different kind of project. It's a task for, activists as opposed to theorists. Not that I believe in a like sharp distinction between those two things. I consider myself to be both of those things. But today I'm doing theory. All right, this is a slide that I think I won't read. It's a kind of main summary sort of stuff. Whoops, I'll leave that there. But I've spoken slightly longer than I intended to, so it's a good time for me to stop and go to Q&A. Thanks very much for your attention. Thanks for having me here. Looking forward to talking to you more about it now.